Hello everyone, welcome to the second part of No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. This is Book Boys. How you doing, Phil?
I'm doing okay. It's a bit cold, but we're getting through it.
Yeah.
Got hot coffee here. We're back with Lysander Spooner, and if you haven't seen the first episode, do check it out. It is up on the channel, and we're starting today from chapter 5.
That's right. So just a quick recap. What we covered. So this text, the Constitution of No Authority, is written by Lysander Spooner in 1867, and it's basically an argument against the legitimacy of the American Constitution. And we covered the first 4 chapters, which I think are kind of some of the densest chapters. And they cover things like the essential points, I think, are that the system of voting is not a doesn't justify the legitimacy.
It's not
of
an
the
expression of
Constitution.
consent.
Yes, as is payment of taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And we kind of started going into this contract theory as well last episode too. So talking about how a contract can't be binding. A contract like the Constitution can't be binding unless it's explicitly signed by people, for example.
Yes, and I think this first quote, or only quote I got written down for chapter 5, actually picks up those aspects. So maybe we should just start with that quote.
Yeah, okay. Do you want me to take it away?
Go at it.
Okay, it's a big one. The law everywhere, probably in our country as well as in England, requires that a large class of contracts, such as wills, deeds, etc., shall not only be written and signed, but also sealed, witnessed, and acknowledged. And in the case of married women conveying their rights in real estate, the law, in many states, requires that the women shall be examined separate and apart from their husband, and declare that they sign their contracts free of any fear or compulsion of their husbands. Such are some of the precautions which the laws require, and which individuals, from motives of common prudence, and even in cases not required by law, take, to put their contracts in writing, and have them signed, to guard against all uncertainties and controversies in regard to their meaning and validity. And yet we have what purports, or professes, or is claimed to be a contract, the Constitution, made 80 years ago by men who are now all dead, and who never had any power to bind us, but which, it is claimed, has nevertheless bound 3 generations of men, consisting of many millions, and which, it is claimed, will be binding upon all the millions that are to come, but which nobody ever signed, sealed, delivered, witnessed, or acknowledged, and which few persons, compared with the whole number that are claimed to be bound to it, however, have ever read or even seen, or ever will read or see. And of those who have ever read it, and of those who ever have read it, or ever will read it, scarcely any 2, perhaps no 2, have ever agreed, or ever will agree, as to what it means.
Whew. Okay, you got through it.
Spicy.
Yeah. So yeah, we got again the fact that people was made by people who are dead, that no one signed it, but also that this last aspect, which I like, is that the meaning of the Constitution, its interpretation, which even in current American law is often debated about, like, Second Amendment, what assault, but what about assault weapons, or how, surely the founding fathers didn't mean you can own artillery weapons, right? Like we are still not, there's no canon interpretation per se, and this is just there's another different text that I would like to read with you at some point. I forgot who it's by, god damn it, but we'll get to it at some point. But
Okay.
It's about how any law basically never has a canon interpretation, and that there is no such thing as the rule of law. So this is like a direct kind of refutation of Friedrich Hayek, if we go back to that, when we read Road to Serfdom.
Mm-hmm.
So Hayek was like, we need rule of law. It's the only thing that can defend against central planning or socialism, however you want to call it. But there's another perspective here that like Spooner also hints at, which is there is actually no such thing as a canon interpretation of a law. No matter how you write it, there's always going to be ambiguity. There's always going to be leeway to bend the language and basically use law in an arbitrary way to, make whatever you want it to do anyway fit to the law.
Yeah. This reminds me actually of like a remember this term that I picked up from some podcast or something. It was some guy was talking about like artificial intelligence, and of course every guy is talking about it now, but there was an interesting concept that like he brought up in this chat, and it was basically like defining a rule for like an artificial intelligence is so difficult because setting the parameters is it will deliver on whatever rules you give it, but it will always surprise you in the way that it interprets it. So what I think one example, this wasn't from this podcast, but of like AI following rules but getting it wrong, I think was regarding like identifying tumors. There was like this or identifying signs of cancer, I think, and what it ended up actually identifying, it was doing it correctly with its training model, but what it was actually identifying were like the images that had like the small medical ruler versus the ones that don't. So in a similar kind of way, when it comes to kind of making rules for people, I think a similar kind of thing applies, where it's like, and you see this in all sorts of ways, especially when it comes to like, there are always kind of ways where you can, live within like legal means, but you're kind of bending it, or you're kind of like, people kind of find ways to sort of bend the rules to fit them. And I think that makes perfect sense in the case of the Constitution as well. There's no reason why it wouldn't apply here too, I don't think.
Yes, and in fact, the text that we're going to read at some point kind of starts out by an exercise of giving a bunch of sentences from the Constitution, asking like people what they like. It's like an exercise you do for yourself. Like read the sentence and like write down on a piece of paper if you think it applies in this case, and then it'll give you a bunch of different cases later that will make you contradict your own interpretation. It's very convincing. Well, I'm looking forward to that. But there's one other thing in this paragraph that Spooner highlights very well, which is that he says when a lady, and what is it? I think he's talking about English law, perhaps. About like real estate and those kind of things. When you what is it called?
Get married,
or inheritance and that kind of stuff, right? Like there's not only it's not even sufficient to simply write a contract and sign it. You have to have people there who can account to the fact that, or attest to the fact that these people were signing the contract without coercion and in health in a healthy mind and spirit, and we take all these extra precautions, but yet when it comes to the central law text like the Constitution, people's consent is simply inferred by like being born on that piece of earth, which makes no sense. It's like libertarian meme of like baby getting spanked, and it says like the first thing the nurse does after the birth of the child is to spank it until it signs the social contract.
Lovely. And I think as well, I mean, this is kind of further down the line of argumentation for Spooner anyway, because I don't think he would also, I think, probably give even issue to the idea that you could necessarily like maybe necessarily even have like this kind of contract free of coercion. But I mean, this is just kind of an extra point on what he's saying anyway. Actually, yeah, maybe I don't know actually what he would say. Maybe I'm just putting words in his mouth. I feel like I'm getting it from somewhere, but I can't actually put my finger on it. But anyway, I guess when it comes to like he doesn't seem to be like an absolutist when it comes to like, contracts are the only are completely free, can be completely free of coercion. When he talks about voting and the fact that people are compelled to vote because if they don't, then they will suffer the consequences of not voting, and will always be affected by the government that does exist, even if they don't participate in that system through voting. Okay. So, moving on to chapter 6, what do we have here? We have a conversation about the people within government, right? Mm-hmm. So, civil servants and senators and representatives. So, some of the essential points from this section are that the Constitution, like representatives and senators, are constitutionally protected, which opens up the way for tyranny. And even if they are under oath to use their power within certain limits, there are also clauses. I think he gives an example of a clause in the Constitution, which essentially kind of gives them free rein by saying that they should never be questioned if they violate their limits. Mm-hmm. And there's also this issue of never being able to deny your master, or never being able to be free of the rule of these people in government. And then he brings up this kind of again, these kind of semantic trick of the term civil servant, for example, being a contradiction. And actually it
who is serving whom?
Who is serving whom? So if a servant doesn't have total control to exercise authority untethered of their master, and we are all held responsible for the actions of our servants, but in a real scenario. But this is not the case with our representatives. So he basically argues that they are the servants of no one, and therefore they are kind of free individuals, and because of that we have the right to resist them when they try and interfere with our property, in the same way that you would with any kind of trespasser that enters your home.
Yes. So his analysis. I'll start off with the first quote, okay?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, he says, the Constitution, Article 1, Section 6, provides that for any speech or debate or vote in either house, they, the senators and representatives, shall not be questioned in any other place. The whole lawmaking power is given to these senators and representatives when acting by a 2/3 vote, and this provision protects them all from responsibility for the laws they make. The Constitution also enables them to secure the execution of all their laws by giving them power to withhold the salaries of and to impeach and remove all judicial and executive officers who refuse to execute them. Thus, the whole power of the government is in their hands, and they are made utterly irresponsible for the use they make of it. What is this but absolute irresponsible power?
Great pick.
Okay, so our backdrop is America's government was made to overcome absolute irresponsible power, such as that of a king or emperor or the like, right? And Spooner comes back by saying that, well, if we have people who are completely irresponsible for the decisions they make, right? if you can send, if you're a senator from Kentucky or whatever state, and you are able to make a decision that may lead to send young people from anywhere across the country to war in another country, in Vietnam or something, and make them die there. Obviously, Vietnam was later, but you get my drift.
The Great Vietnam War
like
of 1886.
and the senators are not at all responsible for starting these wars, sending people there. No one is able to legally hold them accountable to that.
Yep.
Well, how this is completely irresponsible power, is it not? And it's absolute because even though there is technically a trinity within government between the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive, in Spooner's eyes, the ones who really hold the power are the legislative, because they are able to mess with the other branches. Now, I think to come at Spooner a little bit here, the U.S. does this fairly well, maybe compared to other countries, but that still, his point still stands, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult to really speak in specifics. I think when it comes, what this book really shines, it's when he's making these logical arguments against, especially when he's talking about contracts and stuff like that, and when he kind of goes more into the specifics of, for example, like the Constitution enables representatives to withhold the salaries and impeach and remove judicial and executive officers who refuse to execute them. This is like, maybe you could kind of argue that this could be like a technical point that maybe could be worked around through like correct legislation or some kind of systems. It's not really like such a crushing blow. And I think you'd probably find, depending on the political economy of different countries, this is more or less like viable for representatives. I would say also in the US, like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like there is kind of a sense that things don't really change that much anyway. But there are specifics that it's hard to comment on, obviously, because I'm definitely not an expert in American political economy. But I think generally in this book, it's when he gets into kind of real world things that I'm less convinced, or like things that are a little bit more kind of specific. And that might be because, it's talking about a different time. It's probably also because I'm not knowledgeable of a lot of the things that he talks about, but in the same way, I guess. But it kind of makes it a bit more difficult to discuss.
Well, I mean, he makes two central claims, that their power is absolute and irresponsible. And I think the irresponsible part is very easy to digest because it literally says that in the text, and we can understand that from just like public knowledge that,
Yes.
Like, even though there are technically like generals who may be held accountable as war criminals if they disobey certain orders, if you're a senator and you send people to war to die there, you are not responsible in any way at all.
Of course.
The absolute part is maybe a bit harder to swallow.
Yeah.
I would say, to make this point clearer, it's interesting to talk about, and this is also something I want to read with you at some point. I want to talk about Hans Hermann Hoppe, who's a German. He's actually from the very same state that I'm from and live in now in Germany.
Right.
He's one of the German Austrians, so to speak. That is to say, Austrian economic school people in Germany, from Germany. And he has a famous book that's called Democracy, the God That Died, or the God That Failed, or something. And so the central claim is that democracy is essentially a more tyrannical and absolute form of dictatorship than monarchy. And a lot of people misunderstand the book and say that he's for monarchy. He's not for monarchy. He's an Austrian economist. He's extremely libertarian. His point is that monarchy may actually be less terrible than democracy, and
Right.
in some ways. And to illustrate this, I think a good thing to think about is that we had, for example, before the French Revolution, we had Louis XIV, a form of state that was literally called absolutism, because the king is absolute, his power is absolute, it's given from God, he's not to be questioned.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's still one guy making all the rules. It's still one guy in charge. Everyone is accountable to him.
Yes.
And even though his power is absolute, he doesn't have the physical or mental means to legislate and control every single aspect of your life. But if you look at, for example, the American government today, by sheer number of people who are involved and the amount of wealth that is involved, it is this form of democracy that was supposed to stop tyrannical government is the biggest government in human history. And it is, although, for example, Chinese government controls much more of your daily life. Simply speaking on the idea of democracy, as compared to monarchy, where there's just one guy making all the rules. If you have so many interest groups interlocked and so many people kind of scrapping and trying to carve out a little piece of the pie for themselves, big companies lobbying, a military industrial complex, the pharmaceutical companies, the senators and so themselves trying to represent their constituency but also their own interests, much more of the pie will be taken is a claim that could be made. And so, for example, the IRS or something like that, or the FBI or the CIA, the sheer number of operations and involvement all around the world, the NSA spying on every single human who has ever used the internet, that is something that goes beyond what monarchy could be capable of.
I think it's if this is one of his, if I'm understanding that argument or his argument, then I can definitely understand this idea of and this is like what Kafka also writes about. It's like this diffused, confusing system where responsibility is really vaguely distributed, and you never really know who is the person in charge of one thing. There's no one person who can take the responsibility for everything and even explain to you what the hell's going on. And whereas in a monarchy, it's kind of you have this symbol who actually in theory more so than a president or prime minister would have the ultimate authority as being divined by God, to run this country and to run these people. Then at least in theory it's even though I think maybe in practice it's not nearly as clear, because there are still in monarchic history systems throughout history, power plays between people within the royal cabinet or royal house, I don't know what the term would be, but also with different groups like the church and stuff as well. But again, it's definitely not on the same scale, I don't think.
If you're a farmer and the royal guard comes along, it's your grain is being confiscated by order of the king. You're okay, fuck the king. But if if your currency inflated 20% over 3 years, and now you like 1/5 of your wealth was taken from you, because the central bank decided to print more currency under pressure of the executive, because both parties are interested in representing the pharmaceutical donors because they want to sell more vaccines. It's like, I don't even know who to be angry at this point. Who is responsible? Like, the pharmaceuticals, the senators, the people who voted for these guys? Like, but also there wasn't really anyone else to vote for, so I don't even...
A more sophisticated way of extracting money from people.
Yeah, it's like, I don't even know whose house to go and burn down.
Yeah. Well, really, there's
like
no one, because it's like, this is only like I don't know. Anyway,
if the king confiscates my grain, I'll get a bunch of my buddies and we'll, I don't know. We'll burn down the castle wall. I don't know. Obviously, it's not that easy, but
that's what would have happened. Yeah.
You're still powerless, but it's more obvious who fucked up.
Okay, I'm going to read the next quote, if you're happy with that.
Yes.
So, what is this but absolute irresponsible power? Neither is it any answer to this view of the case to say that the men holding this absolute irresponsible power must be men chosen by the people, or portions of them, to hold it. A man is nonetheless a slave because he is allowed to choose a new master once in a term of years. Neither are a people any less slaves because permitted periodically to choose new masters. What makes them slaves is the fact that they now are and are always hereafter to be in the hands of men whose power over them is, and always is to be, absolute and irresponsible. So, yeah, we kind of covered a bit of this in the last episode, talking about voting. Especially this idea, it would be worth repeating, I think, in this episode, that if we think about voting as kind of employing someone or contracting someone for a job, you would kind of expect that that you entering into this contract with this person would only apply for as long as they held office, or would only apply as long as an election was valid. But what actually is the case? What actually is the reality? The reality is that it doesn't matter whether you vote or not. You'll always be subject to these new masters, and your vote is your way of choosing which person will tyrannize you.
Yeah, and on top of that, I think this is linguistically quite big, that introducing the word of slave in this context, simply to describe what you would call a citizen, right?
Yeah.
Because, again, going back to taxes and everything, but if you think about it, like if 40% of your income is taxed, then you only own 60% of your labor power. And what is your labor power if not part of your body? Like, that's just something I could never really separate logically. And so, even if you buy a house, for example, in the United States or in any country really, it's like, this is my house, this is my property. Well, is it? Are you allowed to transfer that house to someone else if you die? Or does the government take maybe 30-40% of it? Yeah. Are you, if you get divorced, if your wife leaves you, is it still your house? Probably not. Do you have to pay property taxes on that house? How much are those? Like, how much of that house is really your house? Are you okay? You're allowed to make coffee in your house because it's your house. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to dance around naked in your house because it's your house. Mm-hmm. You're not allowed to consume certain substances in your house because it's not your house. What?
That's a good point. Yeah.
So it's really hard to break down how much in our democracies, how much of our property is our property, and how much of our time is actually our time, and how much of our body is even our body. It's the whole like, obviously we have this point in the abortion argument, which I don't even want to get into, and I don't really have a particular opinion, to be honest, but a point we often hear is that you should have autonomy over your own body, and I'm inclined to very much agree with that, but we don't apply that to taxes, we don't apply that to anything really, and so I'm not saying that then because of that we shouldn't apply it to abortion. I'm saying, well, we should apply it to everything.
I agree. And I think, just to kind of clarify what you're saying, or like
please
dumb it down, or put it in another perspective. When you say that, like, if you have 40% of tax on your income, like, what does that really mean? Like, it means that, for 40% of the time that you work, you're working for free, or you're working for services.
You're working to fund your own oppression.
You're working to spend money. You're working for services that you may or may not use, and you may or may not need, and also lots of things that you'll never use and you'll never need, and probably mostly things that you'll never use and never need, and
also to pay the salaries of the people who are telling you that you may or may not do certain things in your house.
Yes. As well as lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of other things that you'll probably never ever hear about, and obviously things that have kept secret from you by the government. Yay! So remember that next time you're at work. As soon as like midday comes by and you've got like a couple hours left on your shift, just remember, this is the free part. This is the part that I have to do for free.
I'm shit at programming, but so I'm pitching this idea right now. You can use it for free. Anyone who hears this, I want to make a website where you can print your own calendar, but you basically put in your like your tax bracket and everything, and then it calculates for you and you put in your like working times and like how many, if you work Monday to Friday, for example, and then it puts in your calendar like, oh, today is the day that you work for you. And then it's Tuesday. Sorry, today you're working for the IRS.
I like the idea that it actually splits it up on an annual basis. So it's like, we're into October now. From here on, it's all free. And this is when you know you got to slack off at work.
Or you could break it down by like certain government expenditures. So it's like, you have the days of like, oh, today is whatever, appreciate the military day, and it's like, oh no, today's appreciate the military week. Your salary this week is funding the military.
Oh, that's a great idea. Should get in the US HQ.
I call it the libertarian retard calendar. Anyone? It's free real estate, guys. Please, someone make it.
Creative Commons. Okay, so moving into this discussion again about the concept, the semantic trick of the term civil servant. Quote, "They say they are only our servants, agents, attorneys, and representatives, but this declaration involves an absurdity, a contradiction. No man can be my servant, agent, attorney, or representative, and be, at the same time, uncontrollable by me, and irresponsible to me for his acts." So, we've got two things. Uncontrollable by me, and irresponsible to me for his acts. So, the uncontrollable by me is I think pretty obvious. There's all manner of ways that your tax money can be spent in ways that you'll never know about and never hear about. There are all sorts of things that people in the government that claim to represent your country, there are all manner of things that they can do which you would never agree to if given the opportunity. to have a one-on-one with these people. And then obviously as well, because of the nature of this contract with this like void contract between you and your representatives, you will never be afforded any kind of true compensation from a specific person for the things that they do that either harm you or like directly or indirectly, or harm other people. And I think this is like kind of gets to the bottom of this contract malarkey, and this is kind of like a, you know, we can kind of imagine this in practice now. Like if we think about George Bush, post 9/11, and all the things that George Bush managed to get away with, like, no one will ever see any real kind of personal compensation for sending troops into Afghanistan and upholding a war for so long, not only in America but obviously in the Middle East as well, and like the millions of people that were killed. And so, you might say that, like, why would George Bush be held responsible for the people that were killed in Afghanistan? I don't think you would say that, actually, because that's just absurd. But they're outside of this contract, of this like constitution. But it's like the same thing applies to people in the country as well. And like you could maybe say, like veterans have like some support and some allowance and stuff when they retire, but it's this is also something that you could never negotiate in the beginning, and this is something that would be gifted to you by this this mighty government, rather than something you could actually have any control over. Yes sir.
I had something to add, but I forgot it. You got me started with the Georges. You said George Bush, and then I was thinking about other Georges, and
that's very focused this episode. I was thinking about Georges. My neighbour George.
I was like, George, King of England. George Washington, George Floyd, the big Georges of America.
Oh, fuck. So I think just to kind of like try and bring this down into common, like into basic terms, like imagine, we have this idea of the lowly civil servant, and this term like civil servant, and we could even we should talk about the term representative as well. Like, have you ever felt that like a politician has ever represented you fully? Like, have you ever felt that you could really trust a politician? And maybe if you could say yes to that, what would you do if they did something that you disagreed with? What could you do if they did something that you disagreed with? Is there anything that you can do aside from protest, for example? Do you have any kind of like actual power here? The answer, I think, is probably no.
Yeah, and we can even indulge the collectivist fallacy for a bit. So say you have a local police force in your local little village or little city, little town you live in, and as an individual, I'm making the collectivist argument now. So the collectivist would say, of course you don't have any say as an individual because you're just one guy and you have to think of the whole town. Okay, so what if the whole town got together and said, actually, we want to pay 10% less taxes every year and thereby abolish our police force. Do they have any authority to do that, even as the whole collective? No.
Yeah.
And what if the police force, if they do something really fucked up, as the servants and agents of the town, can you hold any single person or even the whole collective as a town responsible for what those people did? No. So it doesn't even work in the collective sense, because there are simply certain laws that are written in some old documents that even the current collective has no say over.
Yeah. So one of the things that I forgot to bring up, but this is a really good point within this, or a really good point of Spooner's within this whole discussion, is that a servant, or anyone who is even the company that you work for, you don't assume full responsibility for everything that you do under your employer. Your employer, by virtue of being your employer, accepts a bit of responsibility for your actions, and that's because you're like tied through a contract. So maybe, obviously, if you do something bad in work, you're going to get fired. If you do something particularly bad, but by virtue of you being employed, there are lots of things that your employer will either take the blame for when it comes to things that you've done, or just kind of accept the effect of what you've done. So say for you work in a restaurant and you break a plate, you may have to pay for that plate. You never know if your boss is a dick or not. But there are times where you wouldn't be necessarily responsible for those sorts of things, and your boss would take that responsibility, because it's like, maybe you're being trained, and maybe you're like, there's a degree of kind of care that you're being put under. Maybe care is the wrong word, but
it's also calculated human error, right? Like, out of 1,000 plates you handle, one is going to be broken. That's just how it is.
And let's say that your employee, let's say you're the boss now, your employee is rude to a customer. Who's the one that needs to give the proper apology? It's probably the manager, right? It's probably the employer. That's generally how this works, because you were the person who made the conscious decision to employ this person, and you judged their character, and they happened to be wrong.
Especially if the insulted customer is a short-haired woman in her 30s without any children.
Exactly, yeah. So, this is kind of, when we talk about, servant is not the correct word here, but it's someone who's kind of entrusted with a job by someone via a contract, that it's inevitable that the person who is in charge claims some responsibility. And if that were the case, we would all be responsible for all the various trespasses that our governments have done. And there's no way of getting around that unless you really believe that your vote essentially defines your kind of like moral character, or like your vote has any like real direct link to the outcomes and the actions and the outcomes of your representatives. It reminds me of like, during like the beginning of the war between Ukraine and Russia, I remember lots of people online talking about how, saying like we shouldn't be like oppressing Russian people because it's not necessarily them, it's their government that's doing this. And I agree with that sentiment, that like, but I think a lot of people don't actually necessarily apply that same logic to everything else. And I also think as well, like, actually it's like, it doesn't, the kind of sentiment from people that seem to be saying this is more that all people in Russia are against this, which is definitely not the case. But I think the basic argument is that you can't actually be held responsible because there's no system by which you can exert your control over what is being done. And this is...
But you can vote, Nicholas. What about voting?
I guess you can... It's like you can vote for, like... You can vote for which, like, wild dog to let into the chicken coop. Like, which deranged, like, crazy dog to, like, throw into the chicken coop. But you can't control what the dog does when it gets in there.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. Yeah. And it gets really dangerous, and I'll expand on this point later when we talk about government debt. But sometimes, of course, when the collective is held responsible, shit gets really fucked up, because now all of a sudden we have wars or something, and then it's like, oh well, this country lost a war, so the next 3 generations are going to have to pay for it. And it's like, oh,
right,
okay.
right.
Yeah, collectivism is really a cool idea.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you know, you see in just to close at this point, I guess. Should we go into it now? Yeah, I mean, just kind of like when you're in this kind of world where you like, you have this choice to like kill or be killed through your vote. Like, to what extent can you be like held morally responsible for wanting to protect yourself? You know,
yeah, I think this is something that libertarians struggle with a lot.
This is definitely not I'm not advocating for any kind of like terrorism or anything like that. But at the same time, you know, in like Afghanistan, for example, when you have like people who are radicalized by local like terrorist organizations, you know, if your world was like completely turned upside down, and like all these people that you knew your whole life were just suddenly being, you know, bombed from orbit and gunned down and run over by trucks and tanks and shit, and suddenly your whole world was turned upside down, you know, I think it's kind of understandable that you would want to defend your way of life. And I guess we're not talking about like voting specifically here, but it's similar kind of like,
yeah,
it's a political,
that collective fallacy that you just outlined is applied when it's convenient only, and when it's for whatever team you're playing for. So for example, what you'll hear often is in the Israel-Gaza debate is that while the Palestinians had the chance to become a proper state, whatever, in the last century, and they decided not to. And so therefore, whatever happens now is justified. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, those are not the same individuals at all.
Yes.
Second of all, the degree to which they even had a choice is very debatable, because it's not like they had a perfect democracy at that point either. And then third is that the deal that was offered to them was, by admission of the current Israeli government, a complete shit deal that was set up to perpetually basically fuck them over. So, and this is not even me saying that therefore Gaza should free Palestine or whatever, and Israel sucks, but simply addressing that specific argument, that specific logic of like, this country had in the past made a decision as a country, so therefore whatever happens now happens. And there are just so many problems with that argument. And it's the people making that argument would never make it if it was applied to their own side, or they would never condone that argument if it was used against them.
Nice, good point. Okay, so to close off this chapter, I think we have a great quote here, and this is kind of the logical extension of what Spooner is arguing here. He says, "If then nobody is individually responsible for the acts of Congress, the members of Congress are nobody's agents. And if they are nobody's agents, they are themselves individually responsible for their own acts, and for all the acts of all whom they employ, and the authority they are exercising is simply their own individual authority."
The powerful thing about this quote is that the next sentence that's not written there but is implied is, "And therefore, whatever you do to a government agent when they come for you is justified."
I can. I have that quote here if you want me to read it. I don't. Yeah. What do you think?
I think there's another one. Yeah, but if, for example, if you decide, even though it's pretty much impossible these days, but if you decide somehow to pay less taxes than the government says you're obliged to, and two policemen with drawn weapons come to your house and are like, "Well, come out here, we're arresting you, and you know that when you're arrested, you're going to be put into a terrible place called prison where you'll probably be raped, and also they're going to take your house from you to compensate for the taxes
shoot your dog
and whatever,
as well.
And shoot your dog probably." This sentence tells you that because these people are agents of nobody, they are simply themselves individually responsible for their own acts. So if they come to your house and violently try to take from you what's yours, you are in your perfect right, once they step 1 foot on their property, to fucking shoot the shit out of them. And I stand by that.
Yeah, I do as well in Minecraft.
In Roblox. I didn't mention that.
Roblox.
In Roblox, I stand by that. For legal reasons.
The question is here, like, so we talked earlier about, how much of your house do you really own? In like, I'm trying to think, like, why is this logic accepted, or is it connected to this idea of, like, like you said earlier, how much of your house do you really own? There are things you can't do in your house that are illegal to do in your house, like smoking crack, for example. Even though it's your own house, you'll have to pay property tax depending on where you live, and you probably have to pay some kind of residency tax no matter what. And if you want to sell your house, you have to pay taxes on that. If you want to give your house to someone as an inheritance, you'll have to pay something to the government for that. So really, what is like how much of your house do you really own? And so you have this, like, vague idea of freedom when it comes to your own property. And this, I feel like this ties in, or there's some kind of like point to be made about, like, how even though it would never be, maybe it's that it would never be fully, obviously none of this, at least especially in Spooner's worldview, none of this is valid, right? None of these taxes are valid. They're all they're all unjust, and you should be able to resist all of them. But it's kind of like, how would you resist one of these things without resisting all of them? Or like, it's like with the logic of the logic of, like, the police coming to you and taking your property because you haven't paid taxes, right? Coming to your house, knocking on your door, taking your things. In their mind, maybe your house doesn't actually necessarily wholly belong to you anyway, which is why they can come to your house and take your things, because it's already not considered your kind of sacred personal space that can't be violated without, a punishment that you see fitting because it's your property, right?
Yeah. So you're like, this is my land. Get off my land. And the agent's like, this is federal. This is your land is on federal land. We're federal agents.
Yeah. It's like, no, this is actually not your land. This is actually not fully your property. So I guess, this is maybe like something that you can, when people have this kind of like stereotypical like gun-toting American stereotype where it's, you take a step on my property and I'll shoot your head off kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's almost kind of like a role play or something when you think about it in these terms, because it's like you're getting fucked in the ass in so many ways you're not even aware of, or like you are aware of, but like it's like, why are you standing on this? Like there are so many other things happening as well. Yeah, just an observation.
I think a point to be considered is that it wasn't always that way, especially not in the United States, right? Like,
of course,
especially in the beginnings, and even before the United States formally existed as a state, people's land kind of actually was their land, and even the rabble in arms, the Revolutionary Army were volunteers,
Yeah.
So,
and on that note as well, it was. I feel like back then as well, it was. The agents that would come to collect taxes or come to investigate would probably feel a much higher degree of personal responsibility for what they're doing. Whereas, you think about now, like the police, there's such this like culture of like, this deified police officer that's completely protected from any real consequence. Like you might kill someone unjustly, or you might pull the trigger too early on someone, and it's like, you may lose your job, but you'll probably just be like put on leave for a bit and then brought back in, and you have all your your armor, your bulletproof vests and stuff, and all this like equipment. They're basically like RoboCop, and you're organized, you're trained, and also people are afraid of you. Like no one wants to kill a police officer because you're basically dead, right?
Mm-hmm.
So nowadays it's like the consequence of doing anything like that, it's so high and so well known that it kind of makes this like terrorizing of people so much easier. The police are scary, even though they're not. Even though you get some fat ass like shitty looking like lazy stupid like police officers and shit. Like they have the power, and that, and like you feel that when you speak to them, and that is terrifying to me, honestly. That's like level 5
it's
worst
what we
fear.
mentioned. It's what we mentioned with the idea of if you saw frequently people's houses broken in by the police and them being dragged out for not paying taxes, then you would be more aware of the tyranny that's going on. But to really exert tyranny and control over a people, you don't need to apply violence every day for there to be a climate of violence. You simply need to make sure that everyone knows what happens if you disobey, and that 1 in 1,000 gets fucked over publicly every now and then everyone knows.
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 7.
Chapter 7, baby. So this section is about implying other people in the rule that you consent to. So, but the essential point I think I got from this chapter is that, within this kind of democratic system, we have people voting for outcomes, and the way that Spooner puts it is it's like, person A votes to have the representative rob and murder person C, person B, sorry, but he argues, and I think correctly, that you can't vote and imply person B in this kind of arrangement unless person B has also accepted the terms of this contest for who should become the representative. So just because there are some people who live under the bridge that I don't like and that are stinky and whatever, I can't vote for some guy to go and kill them, right? But this kind of happens.
I'm not sure if
maybe
I
not
got
maybe
your
not.
representation of the chapter.
Oh wait, no, this is chapter 8. Oh no,
Nick coming out with the stinky bridge. Let me just read the first
no.
here to get some footing.
I'm sorry, I read my summary of chapter 8, not chapter 7.
Even then, it didn't make much sense.
I don't have a summary of chapter 7. Okay, whatever.
But sorry for coming after you, but okay. Regarding the Constitution, Spooner says, the people have never been asked to sign it, and the only reason why they have never been asked to sign it has been that it has been known that they would not sign it. Wait, what? I fucked it up. I'll read it again. Okay, regarding the Constitution, Lysander Spooner says, the people have never been asked to sign it, and the only reason why they have never been asked to sign it has been that it has been known that they never would sign it, that they were neither such fools nor knaves as they must needs have been to be willing to sign it. Exactly. And I think this is a very strong libertarian comeback for not just this issue, but lots of issues where people say, because it's democracy, because we all voted on it, we agree on it. But often these aren't actually things that we even voted on. And this Constitution example is pretty understandable and graspable. But let's say, for example, I've had this argument with someone over import taxes or import restrictions.
Yeah.
So this was back in Japan when I was working part-time as a teacher. And there was this old guy in the teacher's lounge. And, the topic of import restrictions in Japan came up regarding rice and food because they're very strict against foreign products. And, the position he put forth as a kind of mainstream view is that the Japanese government has done a very good job to protect us against the bad foreign products and also to build up a strong Japanese rice. And it's like, do you realize that the only thing the government has done is rob you of your choice to buy foreign products as well, in addition to Japanese products? That's the only thing they did. They took a choice away from you. They've restricted your options. And, he basically said to that, but the foreign rice sucks anyway. We had it once, never again. So the Japanese rice is much better, and that's why I like this rule. And Japanese people like the Japanese rice. They don't like foreign rice. But then why not then allow it to be purchased? Yeah. If no one wants to buy it, according to you, why do you prohibit people buying it? If your point is true, then you could simply allow it. Really poor people could buy foreign rice for cheaper if they wanted to. And it's a win-win. And then all the people that think like you, which is a perfectly valid opinion, but my dude, you don't have to enforce it on everyone. They can just buy the Japanese rice. And
I 1,000,000% agree with you.
It's the same thing here with the Constitution, where Spooner says, well, if this is a thing that we all agreed to by the social contract, let's put it up for a vote and see if everyone agrees. And the point, of course, is that, if that actually happened, people actually had the option to opt out of the government, they probably would.
Yeah. Brilliant. Let me read the next quote. So this is basically just reiterating the point that you just made, but I'll do it anyway. So, if any considerable number of the people believe the Constitution to be good, why do they not sign it themselves and make laws for and administer them upon each other, leaving all other persons who did not interfere with them in peace? Until they have tried the experiment for themselves, how can they have the face to impose the Constitution upon, or even to recommend it to others? Plainly, the reason for such absurd and inconsistent conduct is that they want the Constitution, not solely for any honest or legitimate use it can be of to themselves or others, but for the dishonest and illegitimate power it gives them over the persons and properties of others. I think there's something important to think about this for everyone. I feel like I see this online in like all different ways, some much more insidious than others, and it always makes me kind of down. Like, you see people, it could be as innocuous as like, oh my god, I can't believe you renovated that house from like an old traditional style and you just painted it white and made took out all like the nice features. You should go to jail. And obviously they're joking, but it's also kind of like this like general logic where it's like, I don't like this thing, therefore you should go to jail.
Yeah.
And it goes to much more specific things, like, people that take drugs should be put in prison or whatever. And I don't know why, and I feel like more and more I've become like less tolerant of this like just language, and I think we all should try and be less tolerant of this like idea that
anyone who's tolerant of this language should go to jail.
Yeah. anyone that is intolerant, no, my day's been too long for me to try and word this out. Basically, I think we should kind of try and be more aware of, like, just because you don't like something doesn't mean that you should necessarily punish someone for doing it, especially if it doesn't actually really affect you. And if you think it does affect you, then think about whether it really does, if in some really real meaningful way.
Even then, this is I think one of the big differences I have with most people I talk to, which is that I'm always thinking about natural rights and what decisions you are responsible for, what things you're not responsible for.
Yeah.
Whereas people, especially in Germany, there's always this kind of idea of the collective good, which I just hate for a myriad of reasons, and they're dispersed across the Book Boys podcast. But like, even if it affects you, even if it affects you a lot, doesn't necessarily mean that you should have any fucking say in it whatsoever. So if you're employed and then you get fired simply because the business isn't doing well, or maybe the employer doesn't like you, this affects you. Now you don't have income. Maybe even your children now can't go to the college that they wanted to go to or whatever. This doesn't mean that you should have any fucking say what your employer does with his own fucking money. It doesn't entitle you even 0.5%. Not at all, because it's not your money.
How would someone try to do that? Can you give an example?
Well, for example, I mean, civil rights legislation, for example. This is a really unpopular point, but if and it's being expanded now also by conservatives, which I think is fucking ridiculous. That, you know, conservatives come out now and say we should add to civil rights legislation things like political persuasion or like religious. I think religious stuff is already in there, but to say like if you can't be fired for being a conservative, for example.
Okay, right.
And it's like, no, actually, if your business owner is a very liberal guy and he really doesn't like conservatives, and he finds out you're a conservative, he can do whatever the fuck he wants with his own money and his business.
Right.
And
I see.
If he wants to fire you because you're racist or you're conservative, or maybe even because you like peanut butter and jelly on toast, he's perfectly in his rights to do that, because you did not. You don't own his body. You don't own his labor power. You don't own his money. And this idea that because something affects me, therefore I should levy the power of the government to pull out the natural rights under from someone is it really annoys me.
Well, I guess it's also kind of interesting, like, because, you know, this legislation doesn't come out of thin air, right? There's been this, like, when specifically on this point of like you can't fire someone for being conservative. You know, I feel like for the last 10 years or so, there's been more of this, like, you know, discussion on the right about being like being persecuted for being conservative and whatever. And of course, like, if you're around liberal people, it's very unpopular to be conservative. And I can totally, you know, I mean, people are so like polarized in the US, for example, anyway. But yeah, like, it stems from a cultural, like, resentment of this idea, right? So it's like, you know, there are enough people who are sickened at the idea of being of losing their job just because of their political opinions. Yeah. So much so that it, you know, might actually become kind of unpopular to do that anyway, right? Culturally,
exactly.
without having
already,
without needing to have any legislation.
Yeah.
Obviously, there is no guarantee, and I guess that is the reason why people like this legislation, because it creates a bit more of a guarantee or like a legal basis to fight for something like this. But I think also it's like, you know, there is like a cultural basis, and that drives a lot of things, including the legislation that we make.
Yeah. I think to add on to that, oh god, I'm forgetting my point. No, come back to me, baby. No. I just squeezed it out. I don't know where it is now. Fuck.
I'm sure
Continue.
We can come back to it. So to go on to the next chapter, which I have already explained because I'm stupid. I'll read you a quote which will give you a bit of an introduction to this section. Well, actually, just before that, let me just reiterate. I think the essential point in this chapter is that you can't imply others in your own consent to rule. If you give consent to being ruled over and to ruling, you can't imply others in that consent. So what does that mean? Let's take a look at this quote. A tacit understanding between A, B, and C that they will, by ballot, depute D as their agent to deprive me of my property, liberty, or life, cannot at all authorize D to do so. He is nonetheless a robber, tyrant, and murderer because he claims to act as their agent than he would be if he avowedly acted on his own responsibility alone. So, you know, let's think about this in other terms. Let's say, you know, you and your colleagues at work decide that you want to kill a customer, and this guy comes along, and you set up a contract with this guy, and he's like, "I'll kill this person for you." Is this like, does this legitimize this hitman's decision to kill? And is this like not completely criminal? I think it's difficult to make the argument, right?
Yeah, like if you hire a hitman, it's not just you; it's also the hitman who's responsible.
Exactly. Yeah. But in the case of the government, even though let's say you don't vote, someone can still, by political force, have your property, have your freedom, have your life taken away through these agents, and that matters whether they represent you or not.
Yeah.
So we also have this idea of the secret ballot introduced in this chapter. I think this is the first time that it comes up. And this is a really interesting point, that in a democracy, in any kind of democratic voting process, your voting is anonymous. And the consequence is that, no one knows, like, when you go to work or when you interact with people on the street or around you in your life, you don't really actually know, like, what band of tyrants are they voting for, and what consequence does that have on your life. And so
and also that the express purpose of the secret ballot is to keep the voters unaccountable. So for instance, if you voted for Donald Trump in 2016, and then during 2020 the Democrat administration is talking about how holding the MAGA Republicans accountable, those people are probably glad that their names aren't explicitly on a ballot on that which one they voted for, because the government could come after them for that. And if you think about it that way, that might even be a good thing. But the purpose is still to keep you unaccountable. And so the same thing applies when people vote on a referendum, say, to send a bunch of soldiers to another country to kill the government there and take their resources.
Yeah.
The voters can do this, maybe not in good conscience if you're a good person, but they can still do this without accountability, because it can never be proven, or they can never be held accountable for expressing their support for this thing, right?
Yeah, and this is even, after the whole point that you can never actually be responsible anyway, because representatives can never are not your servants, and you can't control them.
But I mean, like, if this was an express referendum, like
no, of course, I'm just saying,
like Brexit, A or B, should we kill a bunch of people, yes or no? And the people who vote yes, and if it wasn't secret, they actually had their name on the ballot, then you could actually make people responsible for it, right?
Yeah. And like you said before, maybe it's a good thing that these, at least it must come from a good conscience to some people at least, or it can be explained as like a good thing in some ways, that like, you never know how the government will try and fuck you in the future, especially when it comes to big political decisions, and especially when it comes to the opposing government. So if you, I'm trying to think of an example. If you were involved, if you voted for something that was considered incredibly unpopular by the opposite government, and that opposite government came into power, if your name was on a ballot somewhere or on a contract somewhere, you could become a political target, even if you were just like a random citizen. So I kind of understand that this is like a kind of necessary protection, but is only a necessary protection insofar as there is government, I think, and actually maybe even that it's like an essential part of government that there needs to be no responsibility, because if there was actual responsibility, then maybe people wouldn't actually vote. Because it's like, you know, like Brexit is a good example, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because, you know, and I really hated how it all happened, because it was like suddenly everyone has to actually know what the fuck all of this means, and actually no one, I think most people still don't know what the fuck it means, and most people don't fully understand what the consequences of leaving the EU has been, and you know, I don't really have anything to say about Brexit personally, but like, I really hate the fact that, like, by some kind of completely arbitrary process, suddenly the whole country is required to have an opinion on this thing, and is required to vote on it. And even if they don't vote, they obviously have to accept the consequences of it. But you know, if there was some, I think people take kind of a social responsibility, or people are like given social, you know, people are considered idiots if they vote a certain way or not. But again, it's kind of also, I don't know, it's often just kind of like perceived consequences, rather than, you know, let's say, you know, my taxes went up this high, this much because of this specific thing, or we killed a bunch of people because of this thing. Now you are responsible because you authorized this by your vote. We don't see that.
That would be a very cool idea, though, to introduce more referendum and more accountability and less secretive voting. If, for example, say, I don't know, let's say there is a new healthcare plan on the ballot, and we do a referendum that's not secretive. So you have the chance to vote for this bill, and if you do, your name will be written down, your identity will be written down, and you are eligible for the benefits of that new healthcare plan, but you're also accountable for it. So now let's say the bill passes, and this is a new healthcare plan where, you know, if in the US there's always a big topic, but let's, you know, you get better access to healthcare and better treatment if you have a serious illness, but also your taxes go up 2% a year.
Yeah.
Right. So if this was a non-secretive referendum, you could actually apply that to individuals who voted for it. And if you didn't vote for it, you still have the same healthcare as before, and you still pay the same taxes. That would be, but the point, of course, is the if government actually did this, we get back to something we mentioned last episode, that people start unraveling the fabric and thinking, wait, if we could be individually responsibility for all the shit that government does, we should apply to more and more things, and you end up at the fact that there shouldn't be any government at all.
yeah.
Or at least that any government you have should be anything that government does, there always has to be accountable individuals who condoned that specific thing, who then can be held responsible.
And there has to be,
so let's say,
consent in this process too.
Yes. So let's say in this kind of system, 9/11 probably might have happened differently, in the sense that certain people who voted a certain way would have been specifically, maybe their voter like information would have been sold to the Middle East and changed hands a couple times, and eventually the people who made the call for we can name specific individuals, but it's obviously always kind of a more complicated situation, that not just a random tower in New York would have been attacked, but the specific individuals who voted for certain policy to send American soldiers into the Middle East would have been abducted in the US or something like that, right?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, it is kind of absurd to think that, like, why shouldn't you, you know, well, okay, it's difficult because, again, you know, it's like there are a myriad of reasons why people will vote for one of two candidates, and it's also not even the case that, you know, the opposing parties will have an opposing view on a certain subject and will act differently according to like in response to one specific thing. So, you know, like the with Palestine and Gaza and Israel, like, you know, I don't think Kamala Harris and Trump have that much of a different policy. I don't know too much, but I know that neither of them are like particularly pro-Palestine. So, you know, it's like, if you vote for Kamala Harris, like, does that mean that you're also like in favor of Israel destroying Palestinian children, or are you absolved of that? And there are many people. Yeah,
this would only work for referendums. It wouldn't work.
Of
for
course,
representative
yeah.
Yeah.
But say that, like, yeah, I guess in this case, it's just, yeah, it would be impossible to have any kind of responsibility over representatives.
And it would make people think twice. Like,
yeah.
If you have no accountability for your vote, you know, you might be, oh yeah, fuck it, we should help Ukraine, and we should send a bunch of money there, and, you know, probably prolong the war, and many Russians might die and Ukrainians might die. But, you know, I think it's really important that we have a US or strong Europe against Russia. But if there was any possibility that the Russian government could get access to the information that you as a specific individual condoned this and agreed to send a part of your tax money, maybe people would think twice about doing that.
yeah, for sure. And this reminds me of, I kind of was thinking about this when I was reading our next book, and a little reveal. We're going to be reading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by, what's his fucking name? I should have put this in my mind.
Heinlein. Whatever. Well, you'll see
Robert Heinlein
or next time.
So it's by Robert Heinlein, and it's a quite a interesting kind of science fiction book, and it illustrates some like libertarian anarchist like concepts within this like science fiction world. And I think one of the things that I kind of began to think about in from reading part of this book was that, you know, these changes in our behavior don't happen overnight, and whilst, you know, if a world where you are more responsible for the actions that you take, if that world is realized, there will probably be a period where, you know, we become adjusted to this, and people make mistakes, and people even, you know, just indiscriminately kill each other maybe. But then after a while, I think things actually people actually realize what the consequences of their actions are. So it's like, maybe I won't rob this store even though there's no law that prevents me from doing this, because I can still be held responsible for my actions. So yeah, if it comes to this idea of like you know, having direct responsibility for your vote in a referendum, you know, it's kind of like that, like, it seems a bit like what's the word, like the opposite of what you'd expect. But like, you know, it's like, should we really make people responsible? Because that might be really bad for them. But and it might put them in danger, but maybe it's actually, a reasonable thing to think that you should hold these people responsible and should allow the possibility that they put themselves in danger, because that will influence them to make a corrected decision, or a decision that's not so kind of disconnected from the actual consequences. And it's about kind of like, getting people to think more about the reality of a situation as it relates to them, and what they would actually really do. It's easy to say, like, I want my government to go and, maybe it's not. I wouldn't say it's not easy to say, but like, it seems easier for people to say, I want my government to go here and invade this country because they did 9/11. It's easier to say I want my government to do that because I'm shielded from consequence. But if you were actually really, a actual consenting participant and contributor to this, would you have the same opinion? Maybe you would, that's fine. Then you are subject to the consequences of your own actions.
Well, it's funny because I was thinking, how would a non-secretive, responsible Brexit look like? And so you could, for example, have on your English or whatever UK citizenship, it would say if you're an EU Brit or a non-EU Brit, and then if you're a non-EU Brit, then you pay that amount of taxes less that Britain pays to the EU, right? As a budget thing. But if you want to travel, for instance, you don't get the benefits of the EU. So
say that
it's
again,
not obvious to me.
Just broke up.
Oh, sorry. We could hold with those kind of referendums, if they weren't secretive. We could actually hold people individually responsible. So if you're a non-Brexit UK citizen, then you still get the travel benefits if you go to other European countries, for instance. Or if you seek employment for a different European company, you're still treated as an EU citizen. But you also still pay part of your taxes to the EU.
Right.
But if you're a Brexit Brit, then you don't get the travel benefits and you don't find employment in other European countries easily. But you also pay whatever amount of taxes less than you did before, right? The part of the British... the UK government budget that goes to the EU, you don't pay that part of taxes. So it's not obvious to me at all that we should have all these decisions collectively. The technology-wise, we could actually do this with individual responsibility right now if you wanted to. I think it's just... if we did that, then you start unraveling the fabric and people are going to wake up to how much shit is actually... they're being fucked with.
And at that point as well, it's like, what even is a country if my neighbor can be a member of the EU and I don't, and I'm not, or vice versa. And then it's like, wait, countries aren't real? What? No way.
Okay, let's read the second quote in number 8.
Okay, the secret ballot makes a secret government, and a secret government is a secret band of robbers and murderers. Open despotism is better than this. The single despot stands out in the face of all men and says, I am the state. My will is law. I am your master. I take the responsibility of my acts. The only arbiter I acknowledge is the sword. If anyone denies my right, let him try conclusions with me. But a secret government is a little less than a government of assassins. Under it, a man knows not who his tyrants are until they have struck, perhaps not then. He may guess beforehand as to some of his immediate neighbours, but he really knows nothing. The man to whom he would most naturally fly for protection may prove an enemy when the time of trial comes. This is the kind of government we have, and it is the only one we are likely to have until men are ready to say, we will consent to no constitution except such a one as we are neither ashamed nor afraid to sign, and we will authorize no government to do anything in our name which we are not willing to be personally responsible for.
this talks about what we just talked about with individual responsibility, but also is very similar to the Hans Hermann Hoppe idea I mentioned earlier about the state as an absolute one person and the state as a kind of dispersed voting system where no one is really responsible, right?
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so moving onwards, we have, I think we can probably just kind of gloss over some of these following chapters.
Yeah.
So they become a bit more kind of atomized and specific, and the points are a little bit kind of easier to digest, I think, from here on.
Yeah, he says if we have this secret ballot according to a constitution that no one agreed to, then, for example, national debt, the money that is lent by a country to other countries or to other people, is not really, like, it's not of validity. Oh, sorry, that's already chapter 17. Now I'm a bit ahead.
Yeah, but I was wondering where you're going with that.
He applies the same argument to, for example, soldiers or foreigners who come to a country, like, because there's no
naturalization.
Because you can hold no one accountable. Like, there is no Mr. United States who you can really hold accountable for the decisions, and who has signed the Constitution. All these things that if you're a soldier who agrees, for example, to a like contract that you go abroad and have to kill people according to the government, that contract is void to begin with, because the other partner in the contract actually isn't anyone who can be held responsible.
Yeah. So we're talking about oaths, right?
Yeah.
And this works in both ways. So firstly, in chapter 11, he talks about oaths taken by representatives. So, when representatives, they're sworn in, right? They're sworn in the UK, for example, you have to swear to serve the king when you become a representative in the House of Commons, and probably House of Lords too. But so, in this case, you'd be making an oath to the king, but with an American Constitution, it's like you take an oath to the people of the United States. But Spooner argues that oaths can't be made except only to another individual. This
or
means,
at least if it's a corporation.
A corporation, yeah.
Someone is in charge who can be held responsible.
Yeah. So what this means is that if a representative fails to uphold their oath, there's no one that they actually owe for failing to do so. So no individual who is failed by their representative can seek any kind of direct compensation, because there was never any oath made to them directly in the first place. So this is, why when it comes to, all manner of like disasters that happen as a result of government taking responsibility for a certain thing and then failing to deliver. Like in the case of Flint, Michigan, like the water crisis there. There's no real, I don't think there's any real way that like people will ever receive compensation that's actually fitting as a contract, because there was never any kind of system set up in the first place for that compensation to be delivered to individuals.
And even if the government does pretend to take responsibility, it's like, our health was damaged, and as an excuse, the government gives you your own tax money back to you.
Right. Yeah.
It's like not the people who fucked up the whole thing aren't actually held accountable. It's simply the taxpayer is being held accountable. That's what it means when government is accountable.
Yeah, good point.
It means you are accountable to yourself, basically.
It doesn't come out of the pockets of any civil servant specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it comes out of the pool of money that was already taken from you. Very
exactly.
good point. So he goes on in chapter 12 to say that this same, oath-breaking ability applies to all other civil servants, and obviously, that kind of transfers. In chapter 13, he flips it the other way by talking about naturalization, and he says that this is basically impossible under law and reason, since a naturalized citizen cannot give their oath to anyone in particular. When you become a naturalized citizen in the United States, you make a pledge, right, to become a citizen, but who are you pledging to? Like the wind, as Spooner would say. So chapter 14 talks about the oaths of the South to the Union as being invalid as well. And in chapter 15, as you said earlier, it's about soldiers fighting in war. This is also invalid. And he does kind of say that killing is wrong as well. And just saying, like, pointing out this contradiction, like, because you're fighting for a government, suddenly this is not wrong because it's a government authorized killing, or suddenly it's like, done in for a good reason, and you're kind of absolved of the moral like consequence of killing people. And I think it's kind of when we think about like PTSD and stuff, and like soldiers coming home from war and like suffering for the things that they've seen and the things that they may have done themselves, like, it's no fucking wonder that people feel that way. But it's also, in a way, it feels kind of like there has to be something really wrong about this idea that, like, that for people to feel PTSD in the first place kind of maybe even suggests that, like, there was a huge like gap between what they kind of expected and what the reality of their experience was, not from like a moral perspective. Like people going over to Afghanistan and saying, like, we're going to kill the bad guys, we're going to kill these like evil dudes, and then they realize they're actually killing other human beings and women and children, and it's horrible and gruesome and traumatizing. And then you feel some kind of like moral responsibility for what you've done and what you've been a part of, and it's like maybe you would feel like that. Why don't you kind of anticipate that? Why don't you feel like that in the first place? I'm not judging. Like, I don't think that I'm not saying that it's not something that I would be insulated from feeling. It's more just like a general question to everyone, including myself. It's like, why do we think that? Why do we kind of consider these things kind of different, or like in some ways kind of like morally viable?
Yeah, and as you said, the PTSD could also stem from a kind of contradiction in that deep down there's a contradiction there. But you're also kind of being gaslit into thinking it's not. So let's say, as we said earlier, if A decides to hire an assassin called B to kill C, it's not just A, but it's also B, the assassin, who is obviously responsible for the killing. But as soon as a big enough group hires you to kill people of another big enough group, then all of a sudden we're told this is okay and it's even necessary. And when you then come home, government gives you a government therapist that says, what you did was maybe traumatic, but you're a hero really, and you should be proud. Kind of like gaslighting you into affirming this contradiction.
It's really gruesome. It's really horrible. So moving on, and this is actually a good point because we're talking about international affairs. In chapter 16, we talk about Spooner talks about ambassadors, treaties, and other exchanges with other countries as being invalid. And the reason why is because there's no evidence of these things being validated by everyone in the United States, obviously. And there is also no chain of responsibility. So in the same way as it would happen within the country, the same also applies when it comes to actions held by quote-unquote representatives outside of the sphere of government power. And this is kind of obvious, I think, but it's a kind of good point, and I think it is also a separate thing to when we're talking just about like affairs that happen within a government's immediate kind of realm of power and influence, that people who leave that like sphere of influence leave it also as your representative, and they are also basically free of responsibility from you as someone who is forced to exist within this government system. And of course, as we talked about in last episode, the state of the world is anarchic, and interactions between countries happen pretty much on that basis. So it's even more kind of immediate, I guess, or obvious that like when an ambassador or when a treaty is formed or when like a trade deal is formed, it really has nothing to do with you.
Yeah. The levels of abstraction are completely removed from any individual control. Completely,
yeah. Okay. Now we're on to
17.
debt. So you can take this away.
Yeah. So another one that's completely removed from individual control is government debt, and I'm just going to start by reading the quote. Spooner says, "On general principles of law and reason, debts contracted in the name of the United States or of the population of the United States are of no validity. It is utterly absurd to pretend that debts the amount of 2,500 millions of dollars, haha, very funny, that at that time that was a big amount, right? are binding upon 30, 50, or 40 millions of people when there is not a particle of legal evidence such as would be required to prove a private debt that can be produced against any of them, that either he or his properly authorized attorney ever contracted to pay 1 cent. Certainly, neither the whole population of the United States nor any number of them ever separately or individually contracted to pay a cent of these debts. Certainly also, neither the whole population of the United States nor any number of them ever, by any open, written, or authentic and voluntary contract, united themselves as a firm, corporation, or association by the name of the United States or the people of the United States, and authorized their agents to contract debt in their name." I think government debt is one of those most fucked up and removed from reality ideas that we currently have. Not only because people who are unaccountable for their decisions decide to spend your money and put you in debt, but literally enslave future generations who aren't even born to pay government debt. So this is, I mean, if your government is many trillions of dollars in debt, what that effectively means is that your children and their children and their children's children are going to have to work more of their lifetime for free because someone decided in the current time to send money to a different country or participate in a war here or there, which is, I mean,
$50 trillion to Israel.
It's like, it's, I mean, how unaccountable can it possibly get, right? I mean, that government debt is maybe the worst of those things. And I think there's some points about this later as well, but we're going to get back to the topic of debt in 19. So I don't want to take too much away.
And just to ground this, again, like, just to reiterate what you're saying, like, you know, debt, we're talking about debt, but what we're actually, like, the base of this is, as you said before, like, as you said just then, like, this is not just financial, this is not about money really, as much as it is about your time and what you do with your body, what you do with your life. You are what this means is that you are, and the generations that come after you will be forced to work in order to, you know, pay these debts, in order for your work will translate into money which will go to pay these debts. So, you know, I think sometimes when it comes to, you know, the whole, like, libertarian kind of discussion, a lot of it is about taxes, and I think it can be kind of like maybe a bit stale sometimes to listen to it, if you're maybe, like, for some people, but to ground it, like, in what this means for you physically as a person, I think is really important. And it's not just about, you know, I want more money. It's not like it's not about greed per se, but it's more about being free from coercion and being free from being made to do things that may be against your interest, maybe funding wars that you would never in a million years agree to. And yes, that is, I think, quite important to bear in mind. Yeah,
and it's funny because people on the left are generally receptive to this kind of argument when it comes to environmentalism. That is, we have a responsibility to leave the earth in a better condition, or at least the same condition as it is now, for future generations. Like, we have no right to degrade the earth so that they have a shittier life here. I think, and I'm not even saying that that's right or wrong, but I think that on itself is a much weaker argument than national debt, which is, we're literally going to sign a contract right now with another country that people born in this country in the future are going to have to spend more of their time laboring to pay money to the government of that other country. That is so much more immediate and obvious and directly wrong. But yet, it's rarely ever considered.
Yeah. Okay. Chapter 18 is quite a departure from the rest of this book, and so the central question is, who composes the real governing power in the USA? And, you know, this is another kind of point of where the book departs into more real world things, and I find it more difficult to confirm or deny the specifics of this, but I can see definitely what he's trying to say, and I think the essential point is that the government is actually, and this is we talked about this in the last episode, talking about how you know, there's this kind of fear that if you get rid of the government, then all these wealthy entities will reign and have full control. But maybe the actual reality is that it's because the government exists that these wealthy organizations can control so much of the world. So the essential point I think that he makes in this chapter is that the government is actually really just a kind of tool or puppet of wealthy organizations, and again, who are diffuse and have no face or identity, like BlackRock or like the Rothschilds, the East India Trading Company, which was a corporate government system, and how government acts in concert with wealthy individuals and corporations. Yes.
So, Spooner says, the questions arise: who composed the real governing power in the country? Who are the men, the responsible men, who rob us of our property, restrain us of our liberty, subject us to their arbitrary dominion, and devastate our homes, and shoot us down by the hundreds of thousands if we resist? How shall we find these men? How shall we know them from others? How shall we defend ourselves and our property against them? Who of our neighbors are members of this secret band of robbers and murderers? How can we know which are their houses, that we may burn them or demolish them? Which their property, that we may destroy it? Which their persons, that we may kill them, and rid the world and ourselves of such tyrants and monsters? These are questions that must be answered before men can be free, before they can protect themselves against the secret band of robbers and murderers, who now plunder, enslave, and destroy them. And he kind of goes into giving somewhat of an answer to this. Can you do the next one?
Yep. In Europe, the nominal rulers, the emperors and kings and parliaments, are anything but the real rulers of their respective countries. They are little or nothing else than mere tools employed by the wealthy to rob, enslave, and if need be, murder those who have less wealth or none at all. The Rothschilds and that class of money-lenders, whom they are the representatives and agents, men who never think of lending a shilling to their next-door neighbours for purposes of honest industry unless upon the most ample security and at the highest rate of interest, stand ready at all times to lend money in unlimited amounts to those robbers and murderers who call themselves governments, to be expended in shooting down those who do not submit quietly to being robbed and enslaved. They lend their money in this manner, knowing that it is to be expended in murdering their fellow men for simply seeking their liberty and their rights, knowing also that neither the interest nor the principal will ever be paid, except as it will be extorted under terror of the repetition of such murderers as those for which the money lent is to be expended.
This is really the key point. I'm just going to finish the last quote as well.
Mm-hmm.
This business of lending blood money is one of the most thoroughly sordid, cold-blooded, and criminal that was ever carried on to any considerable extent amongst human beings. It is like lending money to slave traders or to common robbers and pirates to be repaid out of their plunder. And the men who loan money to governments, so-called, for the purpose of enabling the latter to rob, enslave, and murder their people, are among the greatest villains that the world has ever seen. And they as much deserve to be hunted and killed, if they cannot otherwise be got rid of, as any slave traders, robbers, or pirates that ever lived. Now, obviously very strong language.
Yes.
The point he's trying to make is that the moral dynamics under which you're lending a government money are similar to the case where A hires B to kill C. Last time the emphasis was that B is also responsible. This time the emphasis is that A is also responsible. That if and he says that in Europe the kings didn't really have any power at all, and it was really the moneylenders. I can't speak to the historical validity of any such thing. The key question, however, here is if you lend a government, and especially a government that does not hesitate to do things such as kill and so on, but really any government, money, the only way that money is ever getting back to you is that government taking other people's money against their will from them to give it to you, and that is where your interest comes from. So it is it's how is that different from robbing those people yourself, except that you don't have to do the dirty work? Because government never produces any wealth. Government can only tax wealth and thereby obtain revenues, but government cannot produce wealth. And that's the only way. For example, if you buy government bonds, that you're making money is because you rob people of their money. You robbed your fellow men of their money. And we often have this. Some people have this kind of black and white account of capitalism or free trade, where it's like if someone gains, someone else loses, and that can be demonstrated to be wrong through comparative advantage theory or other things. But people sometimes then say, if you made money in the stock market, then that money you got means that someone else lost that money. But a very more real example where that actually is true is government bonds, where literally the only way you can be repaid and even get interest is because government took more money from people in the future. So you're literally signing a contract to sell the future of the future children into slavery. It's kind of has to be put that way.
Can you like elaborate on that a bit?
Right. So if you buy a government bond for 30 years for let's say $10,000, and over the next 30 years, the government will pay you those $10,000 back with, say, I don't know, this is unrealistically high, but let's say 10% interest, right? So you get $1,000 extra.
Yeah.
Where do those $1,000 come from? Well,
right.
They come from government revenues, which were obtained by the government against the will of people working through their taxes. And since bonds are often 30, 40 year, the ones with higher interest rates, are those kind of long-term packages, on a collective level, government bonds literally mean that if you buy a government bond, you're authorizing the government to take more money from the future generation, including your children and the children of your neighbor, to repay you personally.
Yeah.
And now, Spooner was more directly talking about like wars and stuff. So like if a king, the Rothschilds lead money to the king of Bavaria, and then he wars with the Saxons, and then they fucking kill all the Saxons and they rape the women and they take their money. Then also the money lender is a really bad person. In that scenario, we don't even have to go there. We can just say government bonds today. The moral dynamics are still the same.
Yeah.
And that's why you shouldn't buy bonds, at least not government bonds.
Interesting. That's I'd never thought about it in those terms before. Okay, I had a point, but I can't remember what it was, and it's not come back to me. So, I'm happy to move on if you are.
Yes.
Well, actually, this is the final chapter, chapter 19.
This continues on the point of debt as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll read the quote. As long as mankind continues to pay, quote, national debts, so-called, that is, so long as they are such dupes and cowards as to pay for being cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, so long there will be enough money to lend. So long there will be enough to lend the money for those purposes, and with that money, a plenty of tools called soldiers can be hired to keep them in subjection. But when they refuse any longer to pay for being thus cheated, plundered, enslaved, and murdered, they will cease to have cheats and usurpers and robbers and murderers and blood money loanmongers for masters. So
the imperative here is stop paying taxes, don't buy bonds, stop lending money to the government. And if you want to be free, there are things you can do. They're not voting,
mm-hmm.
but they are stop funding the people who are bending everyone's will against themselves, right?
Yeah.
But also in Minecraft, because I don't advise for tax fraud on this podcast,
of course,
officially.
All opinions in this podcast are expressed on Minecraft. We're actually playing Minecraft currently.
Yeah.
We have been for the last 15 episodes. A little piece of trivia there for all the listeners out there. So this is that's the closing lines of this book. How do you feel?
I feel emboldened to withhold my taxes.
in
Minecraft.
in your government democracy Minecraft server, roleplay server.
Yep. Okay, we need to get away from this.
This is stupid. This is so stupid.
I feel good because I think I'm slowly converting you.
I feel like I have. So this is again. I said this last time, but this is the second time that we've read this book, and the second time that we've recorded this podcast because, due to a unforeseen technical error, everything got deleted. But it was actually kind of a bit of a blessing, I think, because the first time that I read this book or read this essay, I was very. It gave me a lot to think about, and I found myself. Honestly, I think about this essay a lot, like probably almost daily, to be honest. And it really
I haven't slept since I read Spooner.
No, I mean
day 38.
No, I'm serious. Since we first read it, I think about it all the time, and
I'm glad.
It really sticks with you, I think, and I think a lot of the argumentation is so irrefutable and so powerful that it's something that people should definitely read and kind of chew through and reread and think about. And one of the great things about the book is that it sets up its points so clearly that when you're kind of faced with something that feels like parallel in your daily life, you can walk through those same steps in your mind, how Spooner arrived at his conclusions, and you can kind of apply it to these things too and think, is this just like, and then from that point you kind of have this like very strong conviction about these. You can feel conviction in your ideas and your beliefs
because it's relatable to your personal situation,
because but also because you can actually explain them in a very kind of base way, in a very straightforward way. I think it gives a very good model for kind of understanding things in the world. And personally as well, I feel kind of like, even though this is about the Constitution and about government, it is also about corporations, and it is also about people that have a lot of wealth. And it's not simply saying we should put them all in gulags, but it is Spooner isn't just simply like, this guy that believes we should all be serfs and work at Amazon because there's no other place to work, or because Amazon owns all the roads and everything. He does seem to be interested in this kind of, not like primitive is the wrong word, but kind of like a free trade between people, and as being the basis, rather than necessarily being deferent to large companies because they are large, I guess. I don't know. It seems a bit more kind of
I
like...
get what you're trying to say. Yeah. He's not just a shill for...
a shill, yeah. Yeah, he's not a shill.
He criticizes government in a way that is consistent and sound in reasoning, and not simply shilling out for, some kind of corporate interest.
Yeah.
And, him coming from a lawyer background is also interesting, because he often starts a point with in law and reason, and then he
Yes.
says his point. But I feel like many lawyers, or even the way law is taught in school, simply is in law.
Yeah.
So it's like in law according to this, that. Whereas Spooner's like in law and reason, by the way. Don't forget that one.
Don't forget that one. Yeah, fair point.
Yeah, I think this text is known amongst kind of libertarian circles to be influential and to introduce people into this kind of world of thinking, because it's so straightforward and because it's also persisted over a couple of years, to say the least.
Absolutely. So I think we can wrap things up here. Thank you everyone for listening. Definitely pick this up, even if you just give it a one go through over an hour or two. I feel like as someone who is pretty new to a lot of these ideas, I found it very exciting and interesting, and gave me a lot to think about.
Yeah, I think like you do have to actually want to engage with this to be receptive to the arguments, because I can totally see, like, if this was a lecture that was given compulsorily at school, I could see like the people around me like walking out of that lecture and being like, yeah, but I think the Constitution is pretty good because I agree that we should have free speech. I can see people just going away with that.
True.
And perfectly ignoring everything that was said in this book.
Well, I would hope that I would also say that some of the language, whilst it is like very clean and logical, it is also very wordy, because he tends to,
as well. Yeah,
it is old, yeah, but he does tend to kind of, instead of he will continue to say band of robbers, what is it, band of robbers
and murderers,
something, and murderers. He will use that like 5 times in one paragraph because he refuses to condense it into a shorter term, which is fair enough. I understand that for the point that he's trying to make, but it can also be a little bit kind of tricky to read. And I think also by some of the quotes that you've heard us read, some of the grammar and sentence structure is a little bit dense or unintuitive, but nevertheless I think there's still a lot of very good quotes and good points.
And as a lawyer, I think he, being familiar with legal text, this text is also written in a way that you can pick out any paragraph and everything that you need to know is mentioned in the paragraph. Like it's not just saying that thing we talked about earlier also applies here. Like he will reiterate the thing that applies.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Okay, so we will be back in a short while. We have a bit more of a structured upload schedule from now on. And the next text that we'll be looking at is The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein, which is a American science fiction novel from the 1960s. I think it won some, like the Hugo Award and some other science fiction awards, and Heinlein is it seems to be quite a kind of household name in America, although I'd never heard of him before. We came across this actually whilst reading No Treason. Heinlein's name came up somewhere in the in some of the research for this podcast, and this is kind of a science fiction view of a kind of anarchist colony on the moon, and it should be a fun discussion.
Spooner application. AP Spooner.
Luna
Taking
Spooner.
the AP Spooner class.
AP Spooner.
Okay.
Okay, thanks for listening, everyone.
Good night, guys.
Goodbye.